All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, State of the Nation, 2018 Industry Trends and Why They Matter. For those of you who recognize my voice, that would be from the IBISWorld podcast. My name's Kieran Newton, and I am an editor here at IBISWorld. I am joined today by our Senior Strategic Analyst, Rob Miles. Hi, Rob.
Hey, Kieran.
And our Senior Technical Analyst, Viraj DaCosta. Hi, Viraj.
Hey, Kieran. How you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. So we are going to be covering today what is the economy looking like at the end of 2018? This is, of course, our last webinar of the year. And for those of you watching at home, it is being recorded and will be available to you guys on demand following the webinar. And the white paper that Rob has written covering the topic will be available early next week. So stay tuned for that. But before we get started, let's jump into how we're kind of going to be tackling today's topics. Our agenda. So we're going to start with a look at the recession of 2007 to 2009, because that kind of defines a lot of trends that are indicating the economic state of 2018. Then we're going to turn to growth and decline at the industry level. And then going to go into employment trends, look at some industry migration, and then kind of end off with looking forward, kind of sum up. And then we'll be doing a Q&A section right at the end. So if you want, please go ahead and send your questions in through the GoToWebinar app. But Rob, I want to kick it over to you. So this webinar is called State of the Nation. So what is the state of the nation? What were we trying to do with this project? What does the economic status of the United States look like in 2018?
Yeah, so with the year coming to an end, we figured we'd take a deep dive into the state of industries in 2018 and get a sense of where we've been and have a good outlook of where we're going. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Viraj to look over the past recession period.
Okay, so to start here, we want to take a moment to look at the past recession. It's been around 10 years now, so we think it's valuable to take a look at these trends to sort of gain perspective for the next business cycle. So to guide our recessionary discussion, we're going to take a look at industry value added, which combines revenue, profit, capital expenditures, and wages to essentially describe how certain industries perform relative to the overall economy. So if you look at the chart, it's basically a graph that shows the number of US industries with declining IVA in a given year. So it's to say just industries in decline in a given year. The first thing that is going to jump out to you right there is obviously the recessionary years, 2008, 2009. That's the height of the recession. That's when we had a peak number of industries in decline. But I want to take a step back. I want to look at 2007, because this is when we first started to see a decline in the number of industries trend upwards. Then as those issues started to build up, those ramifications built, consumer demand started falling, GDP contracted. That's when we kind of move into the height of the recession.
Right, sure.
And the big takeaway after that, obviously, is as recessionary growth kind of subsided and GDP growth returned, you can see a big drop in the number of declining industries. So right after 2009, you look at 2010, there's a drop, and GDP growth stabilized and the number of declining industries stabilized, especially as we've moved into this stronger growth cycle over the last few years into 2018 and moving forward.
So to take a look at what we're seeing with those during that recessionary period is that run up starting in 2006. And that's really a sense of how you're seeing a ripple effect and gains and declines in the economy.
Right, sure. And to the extent that our economy is interconnected, right? These initial declines in some of these first industries eventually start to translate into these potentially even more catastrophic declines later in other sectors of the economy.
Exactly. So what we're looking at here is really a ripple effect. So everyone's knows about the housing crisis and how it rippled throughout the economy. And we can see that there's the decline starting with home building. Then we see developers fall, and we see the decline in banking, and we see the eventual upswing. What we have here is one example of how there's a sharp decline in one industry, and you can have different types of recessionary effects at the industry level. And in the white paper, we look at 4 specific types of industry effects at the recessionary level.
Right. The recessionary profiles of how various industries can react to a recession.
Exactly. So the reason we're taking a step back to look 10 years prior as we're going into our 2018 analysis is to get a sense of what are the structural factors that really move into setting the stage for the economy. The technology gains that caused resilient growth that have really been indicative of where we're at throughout the last 5 years and looking forward past 2018.
So you're saying the recession sort of formed the framework of our current economic status, right?
Exactly.
All right. So let's use that to kind of take a pivot here into looking at these current trends. So coming out of the recession, as we're looking at it, who are the biggest beneficiaries afterwards? Now in 2018.
Yeah, so during the recessionary period, you saw tech really thrive, and that's what set the stage for the subsequent 10 years. If we move to 2018, so we're at our current year right now, we can sort of set the stage by showing where we're at in terms of overall size, right? So we have hospitals as the largest industry by revenue. We have public schools as the largest industry by employment. So we have hospitals really sort of indicating that broader trend that you're hearing about and reading about is the aging demographics and high healthcare spending.
Right, and that's one thing that a recessionary period wouldn't necessarily impact. Right, people are still getting older; they still need medical care. And I also see here that you've got the biggest employer being public schools, which again, kids still go to school, right? But on the trade side, with the aircraft manufacturing and car manufacturing, Viraj, can you touch on that stuff a little bit?
Yeah, so trade by size follows in line with value-added manufacturing. So that's high-skilled manufacturing essentially. And so if you look at aircraft or aviation equipment manufacturing, it's a key industry in the U.S. It's characterized by high wages, strong output, and because of this, it tends to account for being the largest exporting industry within the U.S. And then switching gears into imports, if you look at car and automobile manufacturing, this actually represents the largest importing industry and actually is representative of many broader trends, things like trade in North America, the effect of the last recession on the big 3 car manufacturers. And then the kind of big narrative to take away that I touched on with value-added manufacturing, a shift in U.S. production towards higher value trucks and SUVs. So that's really the point I want to be taken away from the trade discussion here, is that the U.S. is a hub when it comes to value-added manufacturing.
Sure, absolutely.
So diving a little bit deeper into size, and we're talking about industries, we can really get a sense as we sort of broaden our perspective on it. You get a sense of what we're talking about with an aging population and healthcare costs. So we have the biggest industries by revenue, and you can see hospitals, retirement pension funds, life insurance, and drug and cosmetic wholesaling. So the sense we can get from here is there are key factors that are driving these large industries in the U.S. They've always been very large industries, but key structural demographic factors and key price factors have really set the stage for why they're so large in 2018.
Right, sure, absolutely. And I assume that some of these trends also, to get back to the trade stuff, impact that side of things, correct?
Absolutely. And as we move into the top 5 industries by trade, we can see that narrative kind of take hold again, right? So high value added manufacturing in the US is a big hub. You see that with the pharmaceuticals, you see that with the aircraft, you see that with the car and automobile manufacturing. One thing that is a bit different, however, is oil drilling and gas extraction, which has expanded in recent years due to changes in policy and changes in production.
Right, sure, absolutely. And these are just by size. So let's also take a look at the fastest growing part of that as well.
Sure, and we looked at size, but it's also important to analyze the fastest growing industries to give a tale of the tape, if you will. So in general, the fastest growing industries in the U.S. differ pretty sharply from the largest growing industries, but the narratives that you pull out again, remain to be relatively similar. So if you look at wind turbine manufacturing, for example, was a relatively small industry about 10, 15 years ago, but has grown rapidly over the last 5 to 10 years due to, technological growth, due to many subsidies from the government. These types of things have really driven revenue growth in that industry. Switching gears to employment, again, solar power, another industry similar to wind turbine manufacturing, also has seen rapid growth for similar reasons. Then when you look at trade, it goes back to that oil drilling example that we touched on in the last slide, where an increase in production and a shift in policy has really driven growth in exports for oil drilling.
Right, and the shift in policy is especially important there, right? For all of these, or at least those top three, public subsidies are a huge part of the reason why wind and solar power, these renewable sources of energy, have been able to grow so rapidly. And for oil and gas, the Obama era opening of the U.S. to more drilling activity has helped us become a larger exporter. We actually also touch on some of these trends when in our podcast on the changes to NAFTA, talking about sort of these trade changes into the new USMCA. That's episode 29 if you want to go check that out. But at the bottom there, that import figure, is that a similar trend from these, or is that kind of diverging?
So this import trend down at the bottom really gives you a sense of why you have to dig a little bit deeper than just headline growth figures. It's a very fast growth rate, but it's really indicative of it's a relatively small import industry. So you're seeing growth from a small level. So it's not really this massive change in the level of imports. It's really just a blip on the radar.
Sure. And also because as we're looking at this, with the exception of renewables, the fastest growing by revenue and the fastest by employment have very little overlap. And this kind of gets to what you kind of mentioned in your overview, Rob, of talking about how all of these different metrics, the stories may be similar, but they do diverge, right? And looking at them all sort of holistically, taking a broader picture is really important, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at these top 5 industries in terms of speed of growth for revenue and employment, the kind of narratives that we touched on before begin to materialize, right? So technological change, subsidies from the government, things like that. So when you look at the fastest growing in terms of revenue, both IT and renewables dominate. That's because of that change in technology. And then when you move into the fastest growing in terms of employment, again, you once again have the renewables, you have the information technology, but also because of the rise of ride-sharing apps like Uber and Lyft, you've seen rapid growth in employment for taxi and limousine services.
Right, sure. And those are mostly non-employers, right? Because they're kind of contracting.
Absolutely.
So moving into trade, we can see similar issues being brought to the fore as we did talking about headline figures. Another similar issue in terms, particularly for imports, is looking at how large these industries actually are. So it's the same question of, is rapid growth really just masking small industries seeing year-to-year volatility in growth of imports?
Right, because growth is always going to be relative, right? Size is absolute in terms of its position in the economy, but growth itself is going to be for those years itself.
Exactly. And then on the export side, we're seeing the evolution of U.S. energy exports, and something
right.
that we've touched on repeatedly so far. You're really seeing it take hold as a huge export business in the U.S.
But a lot of that is sort of more fluctuating, right? Less of that is sort of longer term trends, and more just kind of based on like current policy initiatives,
current policy and commodity prices.
Right. Sure.
So if we take a broad picture of where we are in terms of the story of growth right now, we can highlight some key trends that are really underscoring the last 5 years of revenue growth at the industry level. So here we are broken out by fastest and slowest. If we look at the fastest, tech trends are really what stands out. Yes, we have those renewables, and these are growth from relatively small size to begin with. But in the meat of this, we see e-commerce, internet publishing, search engines. This is the real bastions of growth in the economy right now. These are the factors that structurally they were resilient during the last recession, and they saw strong growth throughout the last 5 years and have really sort of pushed them to the top in terms of revenue in the U.S.
And shifting gears a little bit and looking into, some of the declines that are illustrated in this chart here, I want to touch on an example before I dive into the broader trends, and that's an example of record stores. So we all know record stores have fallen out of favor. Nobody's really bought records since the 90s. But more recently, 3, 4, 5 years ago, record store sales started growing. So what happened? Simply put, changing consumer preferences. People thought records were cool again.
They were right, but go on.
But with the likes and growth of music streaming services like Spotify, Amazon Prime Music, things like that, we've seen a decline again in these record stores. So what does that tell us? What is to be gained from that little example that we looked at? It's the narrative of technological disruption, right? So as changes in technology occur, as the advent of technology occurs, various industries will gain and various industries will lose. Some of the other examples that I want to touch on in this decline chart also help illustrate some of these trends. So we touched on technological disruption. I also want to touch on commodity declines. So commodities have fluctuated significantly. They're volatile in general. But over the last few years, they've declined significantly. And that's why you've seen a decline in, oil and gas field services, oil and gas machinery manufacturing, things of that nature.
Right. And, the volatility in those prices also impacts the volatility for those industries, right? Which, as Rob mentioned earlier, that's a key crucial aspect of, an industry's ability to grow long term is how much volatility it's exposed to.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right. So we've looked at size, we've looked at growth in terms of speed. It's also important to look at volatility. So in this scatter plot here, we have the 50 most volatile industries, and basically what the chart is measuring is year-by-year variation in growth plotted against 5-year growth rates. So as expected, the majority of the growth lies in the negative to low clusters of the graph.
Right, sure.
And this is, again, going back to what I mentioned in the last slide, due to the volatile nature of the commodity-based industries within the graph.
And then looking at the right side of the graph, we can really see that these are the fastest growing, but they're also the most volatile that we're seeing across our U.S. industries. And these are those renewable sector industries, particularly the manufacturing side. So what we can see is despite rapid growth, sometimes volatility gets in the way. So what can be gleaned from what we have here? On the left, we have the storm cloud. We have thunder and lightning. We can see that mining, oil and gas machinery manufacturing is falling. Prices fell. People stopped investing in industrial machinery.
You can see the storm coming a mile away.
Exactly. Then on the right, we have the iceberg effect, right? These are fast-growing, rapidly growing industries that you may target for growth, but that rapid growth is actually masking volatility. It's masking a lot of years of decline, and it's actually increasing risk in those industries. And something that we track, in our industry risk products and within our early warning system model, that we track long-term growth rates and we look at volatility in terms of growth away from the long-term trend. And that's really where risks can sort of, form in industries that look like relatively strong performers.
Sure, absolutely.
So the basic takeaway is you really have to dive into a full picture of the industry. Even if you're just trying to look for revenue growth, you have to understand, the broader context of revenue growth overall.
That absolutely makes sense. And growth as well is also tied into or able to be tracked as well by employment, right? Which is what we're going to sort of turn to next. So looking at this sort of reflects some of the things that we were talking about earlier, right? These larger industries with more employees that were resilient to 10 years ago recessionary trends and have stayed relevant. But what else is new here?
And so really we're here to set the stage in terms of where employment is in the U.S. economy. So we have all the sectors on the left, and you can see healthcare and social assistance. That's the hospitals and the public schools that we mentioned earlier. We see wholesale trade. As you're seeing, technology progress, and you're seeing the growth of spending and online purchasing. This is really causing a lot of wholesale trade to increase in terms of needed employment.
Right.
And we have a combination of food services. We're looking at, restaurants are the largest employer in the U.S. But where we're seeing gains are in professional and scientific services. So this is something where you're seeing technology change, force people to use more software as a service, contract out more business, and it's really driving employment gains in those areas. So it's similar to looking at growth when we checked it against volatility. Here we're looking at how employment has moved in terms of productivity. So in terms of productivity, we're tracking revenue per employee. This is our key metric of, the value of employment at the industry level. And we've highlighted all the sectors and where productivity has moved.
And so much like with that revenue versus growth, this is also sort of helping to track the sort of absolute versus relative performance of the employees in a given industry, in a given sector, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a few examples I want to touch on here. The first is finance. So the finance sector as a whole has made its labor force more lean over the past, 5 or 6 years. It's embraced technology so it can leverage efficiencies and productivity from fewer people. So that's why the most highly profitable industries on this list are littered with finance sector industries.
And that goes off of our volatility discussion, right? So in a world where commodity prices are vastly fluctuating and things like that, in terms of the core input for the value that you're adding, salaries are really consistent by comparison, right? And that'll always help with profitability.
Yes, absolutely. And that bridges perfectly into information, which is now fundamentally become information technology. So with the advent and growth of IT services, this industry in terms of productivity has grown rapidly over the past 5 years. And while information technology and publishing also includes, newspapers and magazines, this is a very small portion of the sector as a whole.
Sure, they've suffered a lot at the expense of these technology operators.
Going back to the gains and losses.
Sure.
As I mentioned. And then one last thing that I wanted to touch on was manufacturing. This, again, will go back to our value-added narrative. It's, as you can see, it's jumped in terms of productivity, and that makes sense, right? Jobs have moved away in terms of low value-added manufacturing, but high value-added jobs, the ones that take higher skilled labor, have grown. And so they've become more productive within the U.S.
So on the other end of the spectrum, we see high employment, low productivity areas. So a combination of food services, these are the restaurants. Over the last 15 years or so, we've actually seen a decline in productivity from there. And then we also have healthcare and social assistance, which are also low revenue per employee industries. So what is this really telling us? We're getting a sense of, high employment areas not really being productive. And this raises a lot of questions about what's going to be pushing up wages in the future. And are we, squeezing enough productivity out of our current employment situation?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, so moving into migration, employment is actually a great way to track the migration of industries from one region to another. So let's start with e-commerce. I think it's relatively well known to assume that California is the largest e-commerce employer in the US. But it's not only the largest, it's the fastest. So what kind of has driven this growth in e-commerce in California? Well, to start off, it has access to a lot of human capital, right? It's the most populous state in the country. And to add to that, it's supported by many connected industries. Now that it's become a giant, e-commerce has grown even more in terms of solutions to support e-commerce based industries. It's everything from advertising IT solutions to warehousing.
Right, and that's a really good point, and this actually ties again back into something that we touched on the IBISWorld podcast in episode 23. We looked at how Amazon as an e-commerce giant is expanding, like you said, its logistics services, it's investing in last mile delivery, warehousing. And this is sort of almost an inversion of what we saw during the recession, right? Like this, incredibly well-performing industry, that that positive performance is now sort of rippling out and expanding into these other sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. It basically permeates to, all other parts of the economy. It's basically resulted in a mix of gains in both high and low wage jobs.
Sure, absolutely.
So on the other end of the spectrum, we can look at a more tangible example of industry migration. So if we look at transportation equipment manufacturers, these are the people that make cars, trucks, planes, and all the parts. And what we've really seen in the last 20 years or so is a migration from traditional hubs. And this all stems from the collapse of the automotive industry, and the sort of advent of low wage imports and the rise in market share of foreign companies. So as you're seeing, the Mercedes and the Hyundais sort of set up shop in southern states, this is really migrating the entire automotive sector down south overall.
And part of that is also a result of the rise of car manufacturing in like Mexico, right? As Viraj said earlier, the cars that we're exporting, are manufacturing here in the States, is shifting more towards those high value like trucks, right? Whereas more of that is moving more to the south to compensate and to get part of that sort of more international supply chain.
Exactly. So we're at a point, an inflection point in how U.S. automakers are sort of acting, and this is really what we're seeing with GM's recent announcement and Fiat Chrysler's announcement. They're shifting production in the U.S. towards trucks away from cars. So cars, lower value add, trucks, higher value add.
Sure.
And this is really sort of underscoring what their plans are moving forward and really setting the stage for, one of these huge industries in the U.S. and how they're going to perform.
And speaking of moving forward, we are just about coming to the end of our time here. So I just wanted to get a sort of a sense as we are looking at the state of the nation. That's the title of our webinar today. We've kind of broken out all of the individual trends, but as a sum, as a summary, what are we looking at? What is the state of the nation?
So the state of the nation 2018, it's a story of growth and uncertainty. We're on the long trend of a long growth cycle, and we're seeing rising uncertainty, particularly from trade, and in particular trade with China, as
Sure.
we're seeing developments, day to day, as we're seeing renegotiations. So with that in mind, we're going to try and shed some light on, IBISWorld's outlook for what's next. So in terms of revenue growth, what we're looking at, we have the same sort of players here, right? So we're seeing renewable power, we're seeing internet publishing, we're seeing search engines, we're seeing oil drilling and gas. So these are really factors that are, the same that we saw structurally in the last 5 years, pushing forward 5 years out.
Right.
And then in terms of employment, we're seeing those tech-driven areas really gaining in the next 5 years. And that's the taxi and limousine right there. That may sound like some old industry that no one really cares about anymore, but this is really the non-employing Uber drivers that are members of that industry.
Right, and that's part of the gig economy, right? Like that term that we've seen flying around everywhere, more contracted labor, more, right, like you said, non-employers working with these companies that are actually in the tech sector, not in that actual taxi and limousine industry.
Exactly. So that's why you're seeing rapid employment growth in that area. But in terms of productivity, it's all going to the information sector.
Sure. Okay. So looking forward, as we're looking at, eventually there will be another economic downturn. What is that going to look like in comparison to the one that we just, I guess not just, it was 10 years ago now, but, the most recent one?
Right. So in our outlook right now, we're still, tracking growth, and we're still tracking, firmer prices in terms of commodities that we saw in the last few years, which are helping trade. Thinking back to how recessions play out, we really don't know what to expect in terms of particular industries declining. But what you can expect are similar scenarios, right? So in a recession period, you expect similar types of growth and decline and similar scenarios as we saw in the last recession. So eventually you're going to see consumer spending fall and GDP decline. That's what makes it a recession, right?
Sure.
within that, you're going to see ramifications throughout supply chains, and how it moves from industry to industry typically is similar every time it happens.
So the story may remain the same, but the players in each of the roles might be different than the last time around.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. We want to turn it to Q&A really briefly. We're just going to do like one because we did run a little bit long. But one question that ties back into I'm guessing one of the final charts that we had here, looking at the expected, fastest growing industries versus the fastest declining. This question comes in: why are more of the fastest growing industries staying in the top 5 while the fastest declining list is changing?
So this all, reflects back on those structural factors, and we'll try to answer it as quickly as possible. It's technology really helps growth, and you see technology helping renewables, but it's also going to cause winners and losers. So anything that causes growth can also cause declines in other industries. So if we're looking at growth moving forward, a key decline that we're expecting is in wind turbine manufacturing. So you've seen this rapid uptick in terms of revenue in wind power production, but we've built a ton of turbines at this point.
Sure, we fulfilled that demand.
And we're losing subsidies.
Right.
Right. So it's a matter of rapid growth precipitating, a sharp fall off.
Okay. All righty. Well, that is all we have for today. Rob, Viraj, thank you guys so much for working so hard on this. It's been a real pleasure talking to you both.
Thanks, Kieran.
Thanks, Kieran.
And thank you all for listening. We really do appreciate you guys attending today, for learning with me about the state of the nation in 2018. The recording of the webinar will be available shortly. And as we said, the white paper that really dives into some of these concepts will be available early next week. So stay tuned for that. While I've got you here, I also did want to mention that you guys should check out Industry Insider for more of our content, taking these kinds of looks at various trends and current stories that are impacting economic performance across the economy. And you can also find our podcasts there. We are doing some very cool stuff over there, if I do say so myself. Definitely tune in. You can also find us on the Apple Podcast Store, of course. This is our last webinar of 2018, so have a delightful rest of the year, and we will see you in 2019. Thanks for coming.